This is not to say that the slave is perfect and never makes mistakes, but Jehovah and Jesus trust the imperfect slave who cares for things to the best of his ability and with the best of motives. Shouldn't we then trust the imperfect slave as well?
How you doing, guys? The last person on the world I would ever trust is a person that can never admit they're wrong. What I would trust even less if that person couldn't even admit when they made a mistake. When I heard this talk from Garrett Douche some years ago, it was actually only a couple of years ago, where he said that the governing body, the so-called faithful and discreet slaves, were imperfect men and they made mistakes. The one thing he couldn't do was specify what mistakes. Because when a mistake is made, who do they blame? They blame Jehovah's Witnesses. I wasn't in the organization for that long. I was only in for about 10 years, and about half of that I was already fading. And I had already noticed several blunders in the organization, one being the 1914 doctrine. When I started thinking about it, how this generation by no means would pass away until all these events had taken place, well, it was pretty apparent at that time that most of that generation had already passed away. And Watchtower at the time was trying to say, well, if there's only a few people, it still counts. That generation would not pass away until all these things took place. I don't know, but when I read something that says a generation, it's more than just a handful of people. Well, I started questioning it. It wasn't too long after that where they instituted damage control and came up with the overlapping generation, which most people couldn't even explain. And when it is explained, it sounds so totally ridiculous. But I think the biggest blunder of the 20th century from Watchtower was the 1975 fiasco. Now, in 1975, I didn't even know who Jehovah's Witnesses were. As a matter of fact, I didn't meet my first witness until 1979, and she was just an odd duck, and she never mentioned anything about 1975. As a matter of fact, my first few years as a witness, I didn't know anything about it because it was never talked about. The first time I had heard about it was I was already starting to fade. And to say that Jehovah's Witnesses read into it wrong, no. Jehovah's Witnesses read into it, period. Because although Watchtower claims they never said it, it was already in their literature. Does anybody remember the publication? What was the name of it? Life Everlasting and the Freedoms of the Sons of God. So Watchtower, yes, you did say it. Now, what Watchtower was doing at the time was something known as hotshotting. And the longer the hotshotting goes on, the longer the cooling off period after. See, what they were trying to do was drum up more donations, bring in more capital, and they did it with the 1975 disaster. What happened? When Watchtower came out and said that Armageddon was coming, and yes, they did say it, Jehovah's Witnesses didn't hear wrong, because they would not have gone out of their way to sell all their belongings, donate everything they could to Watchtower, and support themselves the best they were to go into the pioneer service. Well, at the time, most of those witnesses had no reason not to believe Watchtower. They felt as though they were told the right thing all along, but they never considered the disasters in previous years. Now, the 1975 disaster was the fault of then-President Nathan Knorr and his then Vice President, the human squeak toy, Fred Franz. Well, they kept building up Jehovah's Witnesses. As it got closer and closer and closer, Jehovah's Witnesses were getting more and more excited. The end was finally coming. The one thing, though, much like today, Jehovah's Witnesses didn't consider, what about all the other biblical prophecies that would have happened before? They had totally disregarded that. Well, 1975 came and went, and what happened? I'm sure every one of Jehovah's Witnesses were disappointed, and Watchtower had egg on their face. But they didn't care. They had all that capital. They knew full well that a good majority of the witnesses at that time would leave, and they did. Some few disgruntled witnesses decided to stay. So what did they do? Watchtower sent the witnesses out to drum up more business, and there was a complete hush-hush. They swept it under the rug, never to mention it again. And any time it was mentioned over the years, I'm sure that was pretty much shut down. Well, at this time, as I was fading, and I started reading, now I had collected an extensive library from decades gone by, and started reading about their past mistakes, particularly 1975. And as I was fading, Watchtower actually did that video where Jehovah's Witnesses started blaming themselves for that. And I talked to many witnesses who thought it was their fault, including elders. No, Jehovah's Witnesses read into it wrong. And they were absolutely convinced. And I'm having to wonder why, if some of them actually knew that Watchtower said it, and they themselves were sweeping it under a rug. Well, that was when I decided there's no point in even talking to these people. They are convinced that they made that mistake. Well, no, that was Watchtower's mistake. Well, is Watchtower about to do it again? See, granted, they learned from their past mistakes and not to give dates. But here is a perfect opportunity. Much like the establishment right now, they are utilizing COVID to implement new laws to take away people's liberties. And Watchtower is no different. They're getting all the Jehovah's Witnesses all wound up again. You remember the bug-out bag some time ago. I was still in the first time I heard about that. Now, my thing is, if you have to make a mad dash for it, you want to keep it as simple as possible. Well, I heard out in service more people talking about these go-to bags, like something was going to happen tomorrow. And here it is this many years later, and it still hasn't happened. We had one ding-dong witness in my congregation who was under the impression that any day now a tsunami was going to hit the East Coast, which is a possibility at any given time. What he didn't consider, now he and his wife were making escape plans by chance they weren't in together when it hit. South Florida. It's about 6 or 7 hours drive to the state lines. If a tsunami was coming, you can't drive west. The further west you go, you end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And I started thinking about this. If you're going to make a mad dash, if a tsunami is on the way, and now you're talking thousands of people on I-95 trying to get out of the state, where do you think you're going to go? My thing is, if a tsunami's coming, by the time you find out, you might as well just try to surf it because you ain't going anywhere. But this is what Watchtower does. They get them all built up. Now, the one thing I had heard, several elders had conversations with me about the Warwick headquarters, and that now Watchtower had bunkers. That was their safe spaces for the governing body and the elites of Watchtower. And I'm just wondering how many of Jehovah's Witnesses actually believe that they're invited. I got news for you. When the day comes and the boys at Watchtower and the boys in Warwick lock themselves in those bunkers, I got news for you, JWs. You are not invited. You are on your own. And for that matter, they've got you ready with your go bags. Where do you think you're going to? There's not going to be any safe place, any safer place in this country or anywhere in the world when the shit does hit the fan. So you might as well sit it out wherever you are. Because I got news for you. Watchtower is only into themselves. And right now what they're doing is hot-shotting. They're trying to drum up as much capital as possible before the Great Reset. And then you guys end up with nothing. Just like the rest of it. And I got news for you, Jehovah's Witnesses. You are in no different situation than the rest of us are in. Because I got news for you. While everybody out here is using their critical brain, you're allowing this organization to think for you. And when they cut you off, what are you going to do? Just something to keep in mind. People who can't admit they've made mistakes in the past and then repeat the same mistake, would you follow that person? I sure as hell wouldn't. I got the hell out 5 years ago, and I'm very glad I did. Anyways, guys, I'd love to hear your comments, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for stopping by.